Hi everybody, it's Mark Myers, the Family Woodworker. Hey, this week I'm wearing a little Christmas green to get ready for the holidays, and we're going to attempt a little art project that was requested by both my wife and my daughters to help create a couple of accessories they can use in their Christmas village, which I thought was a pretty cool idea. And it's actually a pretty easy project, but I'm going to classify this for the intermediate woodworker because you're going to need another power tool that will help you get this project done. So a lot of the videos that I like to feature are simple projects to try to encourage the beginning woodworker to, get their hands dirty and create some wonderful stuff. In this particular project though, we're going to need a wood lathe. So we're going to create snowmen. And if you're looking to expand your wood shop, and I just have an inexpensive lathe, about the least expensive one you can get your hands on, it's pretty small. But you can do projects with wood products about this size, not a lot bigger, but we're going to create snowmen out of these blocks of wood. So I've got a couple that are about 2 1/4 inches in diameter, and I've got this other block of poplar, which is about 3 1/4 inch. So we're going to create both some small snowmen and maybe a couple of fatter, taller snowmen. So we're going to have a lot of fun this week. Why don't you stick around and we'll show you how. So the first thing we need to do when we're working with a lathe, and if you've got a lathe you already know this, but we need to find the center point of our blocks of wood that we're going to turn. And there's a couple of ways you can go about doing this. There's a supplementary tool that helps you line up and draw lines to create a center line for any block of wood. In fact, even a round piece of wood, this will help you find center, but you don't need that. You can just use a ruler and actually draw lines across the points of that block of wood, across the diagonal. So if we were to set this up and draw just a little bit of line in the center here, and then turn it the other way, across the diagonal and draw another line, that right there is actually going to be pretty close to center. So we'll need to do this on the front and back of every piece of wood that we have. And then the next step we're going to do is to take it over to the table saw, and we'll save ourselves some work on the lathe by cutting off these corners by turning our blade on a 45-degree angle on the table saw, and then we'll just chop this stock out of there so it makes our start a little bit easier. So here we are, we're just knocking off those 45-degree angles. We're taking ourselves from a square piece of lumber to an octagon. It's really going to save us some time on the lathe. Now we're going to get this mounted up on our jaws, and then with our center point already marked out, it'll make it easy to set the point on the opposite side of the lathe. And then we're going to get it all tightened down. It's really important to have this stuff tight. I also want to say at this point, we're not going to go into a lot of detail about how to actually get started in setting up this tool or how you would use the chisels for turning, but I'd recommend going out to YouTube for videos. There's a number of titles out there called Wood Turning for Beginners or Wood Turning 101. Yeah, do yourself a favor and check those videos out. It'll help you get started. Also, let's talk about safety. When I start to turn here, you're not going to see it on camera, but I'm wearing a full face shield. And when I get to the finer material, I'll also put on a dust mask just to keep that stuff out of your lungs and keep the bits and pieces out of your eyes. You are going to get hit in the face with this stuff. You've got to have the safety material. Now for tools, I'm just using a carbide square bit right here to help me cut this material down into a cylinder. You can use a bowl gouge. In fact, in the video, you'll see me switch over to a bowl gouge. Right here, but you want to use the tools that you don't have to invest a ton to get started. I just happen to like the carbide tip tools. Now here's where we get creative, because snowmen are not perfect, so the way that you decide to create a snowman doesn't have to be perfect either. But I'm going to mark out a little room for a base, a big body part on the bottom, a medium size body part in the middle, a smaller size part for the head. And I'm also going to create a space for a hat for each one of these little guys. The darker lines in the center there, the two darker lines, I've designated those as kind of waste areas because ultimately I'm going to need to cut the snowmen apart. So I'm using two major chisels at this point. I'm using the square chisel to cut down my sizes. So I want a bigger body part on the bottom, something a little smaller in the middle, and something even more smaller. Good English. For the head. And then room for the hat. So all with the diamond-shaped chisel, I'm able to get deep cuts that help me kind of define in between the body parts. And then the square chisel helps me for shaping. So here I'm using the square chisel just to kind of cut the material down. And then this will be the hat on top. I'll use the diamond chisel to help me start with the shaping, just to be able to dig in a little bit and kind of get that bulging body part defined. And then I'll switch over to the square chisel to help me with the shaping and the smoothing and kind of help me round out those pieces. Now this is on high speed, of course. It takes a little time, but take your time, go slow, and you'll get a great result. And on this particular snowman, I really like the idea of a top hat, so I created one. So each one of the snowmen is going to be a little different size. They're not perfect, and that's okay. The hats are all different. I've got a bowler hat for the one guy in the middle there, a smaller hat for the first one that you see on camera. And we're going to use 60 grit or 80 grit sandpaper to help finish the shaping, and then switch over to like 150 and then 220 to smooth it out for each one of these snowmen while it's still on the lathe. Now that that's all done, we just need to cut them apart. And no matter how good you think you can get with slicing these things into pieces, your cuts are never going to be perfect, but that's okay. That's why we created that waste area to allow us to make the cut, but then we can also do the sanding to finish it off. And so we'll cut our snow dudes apart, and then eventually we'll get them over to the belt sander to finish shaping up the bottoms, make them nice and flat. And so I have a little waste on the bottom, on the base of the snowman. And if you don't have a belt sander like this, that's not a big deal. You can also use your handheld sander with some 60 grit paper or 80 grit paper, and to help you flatten out that base, which is all I'm really doing here, just cleaning up my cut with the handsaw. And I've got a little bit of extra material on the top hat for this guy, and we'll grind that off too. And then we'll finish up with hand sanding back at the bench. What's great about this particular project is it only really took an afternoon to create these 7 little snowmen. And I had that bigger block of wood, but I had not cut into that yet. The work order that I received from my wife and my daughters on these snowmen were for smaller accessories to fit their village. So what I didn't talk about yet was we're using a wood stain, a white wood stain on these rather than paint, because the wood stain actually allows some of the wood grain to show through. And I like the idea of you or me presenting this as a gift and to show that it is actually made out of wood. And I'm just using a permanent marker to draw the face, some black paint for the hat, and I had a little extra ribbon that I was able to use for scarves. And those 2 2¼ inch blocks of wood helped me create these 7 snowmen. Here's the Glamour Shot, and it was a lot of fun. So I hope you get a chance to try the project. Thanks for joining me. Have a great Christmas.